one of my friends, I've got a few friends who are familiar with me and my sort of idiosyncratic ways, will literally text me a photo of my own book and go, you literally wrote the book on this, stop eating crisps and look after yourself. And I'll go, oh yeah, I did. And I'll take it to bed and I'll flick through it and I'll go, oh, there's some all right stuff in here that is manageable, actually.
Hello, thank you to everybody for coming today to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. We've all come, including me, to listen to Jack Monroe. It's an absolute privilege of mine to be able to speak to one of my heroes. You all will know, because you've got tickets, how great she is, how great they are, and also the work that she does, which is so important, especially in today's political climate. She's a campaigner, anti-poverty activist, author, statistician. Have I said that right? And so much of the work that she does resonates with so many of us here and so many of us around the country. Jack, welcome.
Thank you. And I have to say, Kit, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you as well. And I'm a little bit sort of dumbfounded and slightly overwhelmed. So if I'm a bit of a nervous prick, it's because this is one of my heroes right here, and it's a little bit weird.
As an introduction to Jack's latest book, I've asked her to read a little bit from the introduction, which really gives a context to who she is, who they are, and some of why this book has been written. Do you want to read the little bit that we spoke about?
I'm not wearing my glasses because I'm vain around the edges. So if I sit here squinting like that, that's why. This is from Good Food for Bad Days. I'm Jack Monroe. You possibly know that because my name is on the front of this book. And if you're reading this, you probably clocked it. But I feel I should probably introduce myself without all the fluff and PR that comes with a book cover of me smiling nicely in a clean shirt with my please buy me eyes in. I'm a cookbook author, writer, mother, inventor, creator, recovering alcoholic, and I have chronic pain in my joints, especially in cold and damp weather. It's limiting, but it's also a fantastic excuse to carry an umbrella with a parrot's head for a handle and pretend to be Mary Poppins. Except my carpet bag is filled with multiple kinds of restricted drugs, as well as an EpiPen and a medical ID that instructs strangers on what to do and who to call if they find me. I should say I go into anaphylactic shock when I'm stressed, so it will be really quite obvious if it happens, but my EpiPen is 2 floors up in the Sainsbury's bag on the floor.
Thank you for telling me.
And you just jab it in. Yeah, into a fatty bit. There's plenty to choose from. I also have depression, anxiety, severe adult ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that old friend to women who achieve anything at all, imposter syndrome. I talk about some of this some of the time because I've long learned that it's important to direct my own narrative and tell my own story, rather than have to worry about being outed by the tabloid press. So here we are. I am officially absolutely batshit bonkers. And what started off as a slight chemical imbalance in childhood was watered by the poisoned can of poverty and has since grown into quite the gnarly jungle. I've survived violence, poverty, and trauma. I've moved house 24 times, mostly in terrible circumstances, but sometimes in happier ones. I'm also a public speaker, giving talks on alleviating poverty and resolving individual difficulties with dignity and the impact that one person can have on another person's life. I cook on television sometimes, have 500,000 followers on Twitter, and have recently ventured into YouTube, mostly reading recipes aloud as bedtime stories, but occasionally being dared to sing. I'm a loyal, if disorganized friend, generous to the point of getting myself in trouble, and despite a decade of difficult experiences, I still gasp in wonder at the crash of waves on a rock, an unexpected butterfly in the garden, or a supermarket markdown on the really fancy cheeses. The idea for this book came from a recipe I wrote on Instagram a few years ago that I called Self-Love Stew. It was essentially just a pile of miscellany thrown into a pot on a bad day, and I dispensed with my usual recipe writing patter and tapped out instead a soliloquy of frustration, fury, and distress, peppered with scant cooking instructions and finished with a shoulders-down sigh of relief and a whisper to myself that it might just be okay. That recipe was so popular, I wrote an entire book around it, and it's still one of the ones that people send me photographs the most of on Instagram and Twitter. So I wondered maybe, there might be something in this, and I pitched it to my publisher, Carol, who's very patient and gets a new book pitch on an almost daily basis from me, and says yes to pretty much all of them, actually. Originally titled Depressipes, which I am very pleased with that term, so much so I trademarked it, which cost me a whole 26 quid. I wanted to write a manual for nourishing yourself when it's the last thing you feel like doing. And we agreed that depressipes, although a great word, didn't quite encompass or communicate the book as it was when it finished, so we called it Good Food for Bad Days instead. It's the book I've been the most nervous about because in places it's raw, unapologetic, uncompromising, and a bit bleak. But it's also beautiful, encouraging, and hopefully a reliable friend to keep in the kitchen to coax you to take care of yourself in simple ways.
That's so lovely, especially for those of us that have struggled with mental health and being too depressed to look after ourselves. Elsewhere in the book, it's called that cooking for yourself is a real radical act of self-care. Tell us about that and why, when you're depressed, we find it so difficult.
Well, sometimes when I'm really, really in it, and I'm in that deep, bleak, black hole in my duvet, isolating from the world, not taking care of myself, eating 4 different kinds of salt and vinegar crisps and multiple Bombay Bad Boy pot noodles. One of my friends, I've got a few friends who are familiar with me and my sort of idiosyncratic ways, will literally text me a photo of my own book and go, you literally wrote the book on this, stop eating crisps and look after yourself. And I'll go, oh yeah, I did. And I'll take it to bed and I'll flick through it and I'll go, there's some all right stuff in here that is manageable, actually. Because when you are really in the thick of it and you're not looking after yourself and everything feels like a chore, putting one foot in front of the other feels like a chore, brushing your teeth feels like a chore. I open my fridge and I just look in it wondering how my shopping is a week out of date already when I swear I only just did it. It can be exhausting and overwhelming to even think of how to look after yourself. So what I wanted to do with this book was to take all the little manageable things that I could just about cobble together in those periods, and also the things that I could prep when I could feel them coming on, because if you've lived with depression for a few decades, you can start to recognize the arc of it, and if you can get to the point where you're here as opposed to here, I can go, oh, actually, I can put some stuff in place so that when I'm in the duvet, Bombay Bad Boy, salt and vinegar crisps phase, I've actually got some stuff to dip those crisps into that might have some nourishment in it. And I worked really hard on what I call my food first aid kit in here, and that doesn't come with any mystical sort of woo sort of claims around it, that if you eat these foods, you'll never be sad again, because quite clearly that is not true. But it's a way of making sure that you've got this baseline of essential nutrients that support like good brain health and good mood and your immune system, so that when you crash, you're crashing with a parachute rather than rather than just crashing into nothing. And it's kind of like, well, if you eat these things on a fairly regular basis, you know, when the shit really does all hit the fan, at least, you know, bits of your brain will be working properly and bits of your body might be working properly, and that crash might not be quite so bad. If it was as easy as just mushing up sardines and celery and putting them in a little pill and going, there you go, have that twice a day and you'll never be sad again, I'd have done it. I could retire, it would be glorious. I'd be as rich as all my Twister trolls think I am. But it's not that simple, but hopefully it's a little bit helpful.
Yeah, I think when I was reading the chapter on fueling your reserve tank, I thought that's exactly what it is, that you sort of have to have stuff there for catching the bad times. Do you want to tell us what the reserve tank is?
I will. I wrote this 3 years ago now, and then lockdown happened, and it sort of went out with a bit of a whimper rather than the usual bang, so I will have to refresh myself because I've written another 2 books since then. But they're things like, so hang on, food, first aid kit, reserve tank, let me just, I wasn't expecting to be asked this, bear with me.
They're the foods that basically in this book you're saying have these to hand, have these ready, and the benefits of having them.
So things like bananas, which contain a thing called tryptophan, which is an amino acid, and tryptophan is converted by vitamin B into serotonin, which is your feel-good chemical. So I always make sure I have a bunch of bananas in my house, and they're a really good thing to eat before bed, and that sounds like really bonkers, but if I eat a banana before bed, I seem to sleep better. And I also did quite a lot of research with nutritionists and dietitians and scientists into the background of this book. So everything that I've said in here has been backed up by like really smart people that know their stuff. So it's not just me sort of, you know, pulling things out of thin air. Things like beans and pulses are also good sources of amino acids, and they're good building blocks for proteins. And your brain uses this to help regulate feelings and moods, and they help you stay full, so you're less likely to reach for like quick fix sugary snacks and pot noodles and crisps and things. Things like breakfast cereals, which are often fortified with calcium. Things like cheese, which you might not be surprised to know, cheese also increases serotonin production. So cheese literally makes you happy. Eat all the cheese, because it's scientifically proven that cheese makes you feel good. So fill your boots, literally fill your boots. Things like chicken, again, source of tryptophan and other amino acids that support normal production of serotonin. Chocolate, again, makes you feel really good, scientifically backed. Chocolate makes you feel good, especially dark chocolate. It's like lentils, nuts, oats, oily fish, leafy green vegetables, tofu, water. Staying hydrated is absolutely vital for normal brain function and like your normal body function. Whole grains, again, tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin, helps regulate your moods, helps you sleep better, helps to sort of regulate your brain function. And it's just loads of stuff in there. And it seems like quite a big list, but actually if I have like 2 cans of sardines a week, some whole grains and some cereal and some leafy greens, that's a pretty good baseline to start with. Finish that off with like a cheese platter and a load of chocolate, and you'll be fine.
Unlike some of your other books where you've costed things, this isn't costed at the end of the recipe, but so much of it is a tin of, a packet of dried food, stuff that we can afford to buy, or hopefully afford to buy. Obviously not everyone can afford, as we know. Won't get into the food crisis. Well, I will. We'll get onto that later. But so much of this is accessible, easy to buy, easy to find food, lots of, if you like, shortcuts, because you can have a tin of something, it's not going to go off. Tell us about your thinking behind having so many recipes using this type of food.
Well, after 10 years of doing this entirely by accident, and no one is more surprised than I am that this is where I've ended up, except maybe my food technology teacher, who did actually get in touch a couple of years ago just to check that I was the same person that she'd taught for GCSE food tech 20 years ago and failed. Not because I wasn't any good at cooking, but because I wasn't any good at writing about it, ironically. I would do all the practical stuff and then not do my coursework, which actually is pretty much how I still operate, much to the frustration of my publisher. I like getting in the kitchen and making the mess, but I wish someone would follow me around with a pen and paper going 120 grams of onion and a couple of teaspoons of herbs, because that's the bit that I find really tricky. But completely forgot what the question was. Sorry, Kit.
Your thinking behind having tins, packets, and that kind of food in your recipes?
Well, that is just how I cook and how I live. I do have an occasional side hustle, which is where a friend or a friend of a friend or a friend of a friend of a friend will say, will you come round my house and cook a really fancy dinner for me and my friends, and then piss off 10 minutes before it's served so I can pretend I did it myself. And I can really go to town then. I can go to Borough Market, I can buy all the nice mushrooms, I can make ludicrous recipes that wouldn't be out of place on MasterChef. But that's not the stuff that I write about, because I like to do it every now and then to prove that I can, and to sort of broaden my horizons and stuff like that. But actually what I'm about is the everyday, taking the sort of the inaccessibility and the food snobbery out of it. Ironically, it's why I don't have a cookery series on television, because of all the times it's been pitched to me by like documentary producers or TV companies. They want to put me in a kitchen the size of an aircraft hangar, sponsor it by KitchenAid, and then they get absolutely horrified when I pull out like cans of mushy peas and dried noodles, and I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Oh, it's not very glamorous, Jack. Or it doesn't look very nice on telly, that stewed steak. And I'm like, no, but what it turns it into is going to look delicious. It's like witchcraft. It's a proper like, put all this stuff in a pan and it looks absolutely ghastly, but just wait, give it 20 minutes. Ah, look, a fish water. But yeah, they're all a bit weirded out by all the tins and all the dried stuff and all the store cupboard basics, because it's not like hand-reared, massaged beef and organic this, that, and the other. And with my old publisher, I had this thing backwards and forwards through my first and second book, where the sub-editor, copy editor, some editor, would email me every single recipe. Oh, what kind of oil is this, Jack? Whatever you've got. But what kind of oil? Is it olive oil? No, oil. Light cooking oil, vegetable oil, sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, peanut oil, whatever you've got in the cupboard. And I'd come back, what kind of rice, Jack? Whatever rice you've got. Is this, what kind of salt is this? It's just salt. it's literally just salt. And that's been a source of frustration, because I try to not be too prescriptive in my recipes, because it really is what you've got to hand. It might not turn out exactly how I made it in my kitchen, but I'd rather somebody cooked something that was an approximation of one of my recipes using what they had to hand and had something to eat, than used like their last quid going to buy a certain kind of sardine or a certain brand of oil or something, because it's not necessary. You can mix and match and chop and change to within an inch of its life, and it's still going to turn out all right.
Yeah. And what's your process? Some of these recipes, I remember the first recipe of yours that I ever saw was something that said something like peach curry or something. And I remember thinking, that's got to be disgusting. And it wasn't, and I was so shocked. So how do you come up with some of the recipes in here which I've never seen before, combinations I've never heard before? Do you just have a brainwave? I think I saw a blog of yours once where you said you got up in the middle of the night or something because you thought, I've got an idea, and then you make it. Do you make these recipes like 5 times to know they work, or what's the process?
I tend to triple test, but that's just really the first time round is a flail around what I've got, what I think will go together, chuck it all in the pan. Ooh, that was delicious. What did I do? I should probably make that again and write it down. and then I make it again, and then I do it a third time, and I rigorously time everything and weigh everything. And I've got some very, very dodgy scales in my house that I bought from a very, very dodgy smoke shop on Pier Hill. I live in a little seaside town. And I saw these little scales in the window, and they're really, really accurate, tiny little black scales. And I went in, and I was like, can I have some of those can I have a set of those scales, please? And the guy looked at me, and I think I had a suit jacket on at the time. I don't think I looked like his regular clientele. And I was like, I want them for weighing spices. And he was like, interesting. and I do, and I use these tiny little, extraordinarily accurate scales for weighing out like a teaspoon of turmeric or a teaspoon of herbs and whatever. And I've been getting quite a lot of abuse online lately. And the Essex police turned up at my house a few weeks ago. I hadn't called them. They were doing a welfare check because they'd been made aware that people were making nefarious threats to my livelihood and my son and whatever, and they thought they'd just swing by, completely unalarmingly, not 2 squad cars outside my house in my lovely neighbourhood. And my neighbours don't talk to me anyway. I was like, this is bad. And they turned up, and they're walking through my kitchen, and there's these little scales sitting there. And I'd been making my own ketchup. So these little tiny black dodgy looking scales had MSG sprinkled all over the top of them, which is a fine white powder. And they walked in, and they stood there in my kitchen, and they were talking to me, and they were looking, and I was like, if I don't say anything and they don't say anything, we can just pretend that doesn't look like what it looks like. And neither of us said anything. We walked through to the lounge. I made them a cup of tea, and it was all fine. But I've probably got some soft information on my file somewhere. Keep an eye on that one. Heavily tattooed, bit erratic, dodgy little scales in a kitchen. But yeah, I mean, my process tends to be open the cupboard, see what's in it, chuck some stuff in a pan, see what works. As long as it's got, some protein in it and some flavour in it and a bit of salt and a bit of fat and a bit of acid, not like battery acid, like lemon or vinegar or whatever. I had to clarify that in a recipe once for someone. Acid. And I was like, oh, for God's sake. I know I do look eminently dodgy, but vinegar. Vinegar or lemon juice or lime juice. And just tweak it, balance it, and 99% of the time it works, and 1% of the time it just needs a little bit more work. And I just go for it. But that peach curry that you were talking about, I love that recipe.
So good.
And what I love most about it is the number of people over the years who've commented, I tried this because it sounded horrible. You, my friend, need to evaluate your life choices. And I couldn't quite believe all the rave reviews it had, so I thought I'd try it for myself, and now me and my family have it twice a week. I'm like, what's not to like?
It's so good. And one of the things I love about your recipes is their affordability. I can remember reading a recipe of yours that you had priced salt, and you'd said, the salt in this will cost 2p or whatever it is. So often we see recipes that will say, this recipe is £2 a head, and then they'll say, but you will need oil, tomato puree, and all those things.
It really, really grates my bollocks. It really, really does. When people go, this 5-ingredient recipe, and you look at it and you go, well, it's 5 ingredients plus oil, flour, salt, pepper, herbs, spices. Well, that's 11 ingredients, my friend, I can count. That is not a 5-ingredient recipe. Or people who don't cost those things into their recipes. They say, oh, this is a £1 meal. And you're like, well, it's not a £1 meal because 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil is 5p because it's £5 for 3 litres at the moment because the price of that's shot up lately. Your little pinch of salt costs that in at a penny because it's 30p for 750 grams of table salt. Your pepper's a penny because it's £1 for 100 grams if you get it from the world food aisle, not from the spices aisle. Your herbs are 30p for 14 grams if you can find a supermarket that still has them in the value range. And all of those incremental things add up because if you don't have it in the cupboard, you've got to go and buy it for the recipe. And I did a recipe once just to make a point. I like making a point, especially on Twitter. It's that 280 character limit. I love the nuance of it. Where people were saying, oh, well, it was round about the last the last phase of Tories going, oh, everyone can eat on a budget, it's really easy, look at Jack Monroe. I'm like, don't you dare use me as a prop to prop up your austerity ideology, because I will come down on you like a ton of bricks. So I costed up a recipe, and I did all the ingredients, and then the price of the pan, and then the price of the gas card, and then the price of the oven, and then the price of the rent, and the price of the fuel, and the price of the council tax, and it came to about $2,500 for like a noodle dish. And I was like, there you go, so easy it is to cook on the cheap, because guess what? If you haven't got a home, or an oven, or money on your gas card, or a saucepan, or a wooden spoon, you can't make the fucking noodles, can you?
Yeah.
And I pull that out every now and then when people are saying, oh, well, who needs to rinse spaghetti hoops? And you're like, people who live in B&Bs, people who've fled domestic violence and don't have anywhere to live, and they're living in a hostel, and they've, people who live in student accommodation, people who live in shared housing where there's 9 of them sharing a kitchen, people who don't have an oven, people who don't have any gas on the gas card. Guess what? Lots of people need to rinse spaghetti hoops, and just because you weren't one of them and you don't know any of them doesn't mean those people don't exist. Just because their experiences are outside the realm of what you can imagine people's lives, everyday lives, are really like, doesn't mean that those people's situations aren't real and valid. And I get into those arguments quite a lot lately, because it seems, firstly, because I'm belligerent and I can't let things lie like that. And secondly, because okay, you may never have come across somebody in those circumstances, or it may never have occurred to you that people may be living that way, but let me tell you about it, and then you'll know, and then you won't have an excuse to be such an ignorant prick next time. There you go.
And talking about the cost of food, and the work that you've done about the cost of living, tell us about the Vimes Boots Index, which I absolutely love, and which demonstrates exactly how expensive it is to be poor.
So the Vimes Boots Index is it's one of those things that I talked myself into. There's been a phenomenal amount of work that I possibly didn't consider at the time. But it was around sort of the prices of food in the supermarket and the prices of basics and value range products, which I'd noticed have been steadily disappearing over the last 10 years. And it's impossible not to notice when you record the prices of food as forensically as I do on a daily basis over a 10-year period. When I started writing recipes in 2012, you could get 10 stock cubes from the Sainsbury's Basics range for 10p. In 2013, they went up to 15p for 10. In 2014, they went up to 30p. In 2015, they jumped to 50p. And then they went all the way to £1. Now they're back down, hovering at about 60p, because someone made a fuss. That's still a 600% price increase on what they were. And a Charlie Bigham's ready meal, nothing against them. I've had the odd one, usually at other people's houses. People get nervous about cooking for me for some reason. They don't realise I eat like McDonald's and Tesco cheese and onion sandwiches on my off days. But Charlie Bigham's ready meal, in the same time period, 2012 to now, has been £7.50 the whole time. Now, if the M&S dine-in for 2 for £10 deal has been £10 for the last 10 years. So if the cost of luxury food products had risen at the same rate as the cost of basic food products, that M&S dine-in for 2 would be £100. Wow. That Charlie Bigham's ready meal would be about 65 quid. But it is routinely and consistently the people who have the least available in their disposable income margins, by which I mean nothing, who have to shoulder the price rises on disappearing basics and value range products to prop up the 3 for 20 quid packets of Strongbow and the £10 meal deals. Because it's a group of people who don't really have a recourse to public outcry, who don't have the voices in the media to go, excuse me, this is an outrage. They just suck it up. They just buy less. They eat less. They have less. And I was laying in bed. I used to have a radio alarm clock that would wake me up with the Today programme in the morning. I have since realised that's a terrible idea because I wake up furious on a daily basis. So I've changed that now to wake up, it's a beautiful morning, mostly out of sarcasm, but actually it does kind of work. But I was laying in bed and the news drifted in. Official inflation figures were something like 8%. And I was like, that's not right. That doesn't chime with my experience at the supermarket. That doesn't chime with the experiences of the food banks that are running out of products, because when the prices of those products spike, people donate less because it tends to be people who have got less who give more to food banks, people who've just escaped that situation themselves and want to give back, or people who don't have very much to spare but are sharing it. And when those prices go up, the donations to food banks go down. So the need for food banks goes up because people can afford to buy less, but the stock that they hold goes down. So I dug out my supermarket receipts because I'm a hoarder and I knew they would come in handy one day. And I went through them and I did a couple of tweets about how the prices of basic food products had changed over the last couple of years. Things like a bag of rice had gone up 344%, and it got some traction. I've been banging on about this for a decade, and no one's really cared about the price of stock cubes, but for some reason, about 5 million people read that tweet. And so I decided I would start to track it in something called the Vimes Boots Index. Well, I said this, being like, I've got a box of receipts, this will be a piece of cake. It is not a piece of cake. It's a reason why the Office of National Statistics has got about 60 members of full-time staff, because it's a complicated and difficult job, and it's still one that is underway. I'm hoping to publish it in full by the end of the year. It is a compilation of 120 products and how the prices of those products have changed in supermarkets over the last 10 years, and to track inflation as it really happens to people with the least. Now, the Office of National Statistics have been brilliant. For somebody whose first dealings with me was for me to give them a public clobbering, they got in touch and they said, we'd like to work with you on this. We'd like to track inflation at different income deciles. We've got the resources to do it.
What were they measuring before you got into
an average?
And what sort of products?
Things like legs of lamb, bedroom furniture, bottles of champagne, those everyday essentials.
Yeah.
And that was another thing. Picking those 120 products was a minefield, because a lot of it is stuff that I use in my recipes all the time, so like sardines, but chicken, all right? Chicken was one. Chicken gave me a headache, because in 3 of the 4 major supermarkets, you could buy a bag of chicken wings for about £1.70, but in one of them, you could only buy frozen chicken wings. But that's not a like-for-like product, because the frozen ones were cheaper, but the other ones didn't all have frozen chicken wings. So it was like, oh God, where's it? So I had to go for drums and thighs, but the pack sizes were different, and they were going for things like sanitary protection and other things like washing up liquid and shampoo, and trying to screw down 120 like-for-like products that were available at all the big 4 supermarkets has been really the bulk of doing the work. And then getting the pricing data by crowdsourcing people's dusty old shopping receipts over the last 10 years into my email inbox, and then sifting through them and inputting all of that data while being GDPR compliant was... It's been a lot of work, and a lot of surprising work, actually. Because although for the supermarket I shop in, and the one I used to shop in, because it was where Sainsbury's and Asda, basically, I know that stuff. Like, for some reason, I can't even remember my son's birthday sometimes, but I can remember the price of stock cubes in Sainsbury's in 2013. I've got that information screwed into my brain. I don't have it for the other 2 supermarkets. And I need to back everything up and evidence it and reference it. But the ONS have been great, and they've also started tracking things across different income deciles. They released a press statement shortly after saying they were no longer going to measure the price of one kind of apple at the supermarket, but every kind of apple at every supermarket. I was like, ambitious, but good, you crack on, and I'll crack on with my bit, and we'll see where we end up. So the index is nearly done, and then I'm going to send it to the big boys at the ONS who are going to mark my homework and make sure that I've, that it's all presented nicely and make me some snazzy graphics and stuff, and then I can release it into the wild.
It's such a good piece of work, and it's going to demonstrate how austerity and inflation is impacting the most vulnerable, as we know.
Yeah. And there were some leading financial and economic journalists who argued with me something chronic at the start, saying, no, everyone experiences the same inflation, this is why you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. I'm a balding white man who works for the Financial Times, and I know what I'm talking about. And I've just sat and waited, and then the ONS released their provisional report last week, and it showed that inflation for people across the lowest income deciles was many, many times higher than inflation as an average. And I've waited for the apology to come from certain quarters, but must be something wrong with the refresh button on my Twitter, because I can't see it anywhere. But it's not about being right. It's never about being right. It's about having a set of irrefutable statistics that gives campaigners, activists, campaign groups, lobby groups, a statistic to work from to say, well, actually, benefits need to be uprated by 18% because that's the rate of inflation that people in poverty experience. A real living wage needs to be this much because that's how much this basket of goods costs. It's working with people like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It's working with all these different groups of people to say, well, now we've got some data. And, people like data. You can't really argue with it. Rather than this gobby little tattooed left-winger going, meep, 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 life's a bit expensive to be poor, we've got graphs now, and we're going to use them.
Excellent. And despite all this good work that you're doing, the hard data, the irrefutable facts that prove where we are, you do get a lot of abuse on Twitter and elsewhere. And talking about self-care, how do you manage that?
99% of the time, I can read it, roll my eyes, go, oh, fuck off, and put my phone down. But sometimes it really gets in, and it jabs at my squishy bits, and it hurts when people say things about me that aren't true. And I know who I am. I know what drives me. I know what motivates me. I know what's in my bank account. I know the reasons why I do the things that I do. And I have to really hold tight to that sometimes, to those core values and those core beliefs and the things that I know to be true about myself, that first name bunch of numbers with no avatar on Twitter is trying to tear to shreds. And it's hard sometimes because it gets awfully noisy. And it's a complete no-win situation, because if I don't respond to it, then oh, well, she hasn't refuted it, it must be true. If I do respond to it, it's the equivalent of being on the pyramid stage at Glastonbury, performing a set and handing the mic to a heckler and going, here you go, say what you like about me, I'm going to share it with this 500,000 people. So it's always this dichotomy between, do I hold my tongue and swear under my breath about you, or do I bat you back under your rock? And sometimes I'm batting back under their rock, but most of the time I have to just go, it's not true. The things they're saying about you are not true, and drawing attention to them is just going to draw 500,000 people's attention to that, and a handful of those people will choose the dark side. They will choose to go, ooh, no smoke without fire, you must be a millionaire with your Russell and Bromley loafers. I nicked them for a press shoot about 6 years ago. I didn't actually nick them. I was just still wearing them when everyone went home, and I realised afterwards, and I sent a really panicked email to the PR thinking, oh God, they're journalists, they're going to write that I'm a terrible person and a thief and that I stole the nice shoes. And the PR person just emailed back and went, oh, just keep them. Oh, okay. thank you very much for the fancy shoes, but I've got nowhere to wear them apart from Asda, but I'm going to wear them to Asda now. But yeah, I've just got to hang tight and go, the things that they're saying are not true. They are designed to unsettle me, unseat me, delegitimize me, and and it's always quite telling that, and for legal reasons, I'm not suggesting that these events are directly related, but for example, I was on Good Morning Britain a couple of weeks ago, and I was on with a guy from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and we were talking about energy price caps. And surprisingly to me, the person from the Institute of Economic Affairs was all gung-ho about energy companies and how great they were and how brilliant they were, and they're practically, a model for society. And I was like, is anyone going to declare that you're funded by energy companies, or is that down to me to point out to this audience of 2 million people that you actually have a financial interest in promoting these people? And hell broke loose. The production team behind the scenes were like going away Googling and looking up legal things. And, can she say that? Can she say, no? And afterwards they were like, Jack. And I was like, no, I'm not. If I was being paid by an energy company and I went on national television and went, energy companies are great, somebody would call me out on it. So why can't I call them out on it? And it seems to be every time I do something like that is a direct spanner in the spokes of the establishment, the attacks increase like 20-fold online from quickly set up anonymous accounts designed to delegitimize me and make me out to be a fraud, a liar, a scammer, not what I seem, all of those things. And I'm like, that's, I can see this for what it is. It's an establishment shitstorm. But many have tried over the years. If there was really a murky, horrible, secret, whatever going on in my background, some of the investigative hacks that have trolled and plagued my family and friends, doorstepped my sick, disabled mother, befriended the people who I might have breathed on in a playground once at the age of 7 on Facebook, and people who, there is a vested interest. It's hard not to talk about this without sounding nuts, but there has been a core of people who think they're journalists, but not really, who have spent the last 10 years digging for the dirt on me. And if there was any, they'd have found it. And they'd have had no hesitation whatsoever in plastering it all over their murky rags. And unfortunately, I'm just rather boring, a bit Ronsil. I am exactly what you see is what you get. And I'm not shy about telling my own dirty stories and, raking up all my own muck from my past. I know I'm imperfect. I know I get things wrong. I'm disorganized. I take too much on. I swear like a sailor. I'm probably, I am not brilliant with money for somebody who writes books about how to be good with money. But in my defense, I've only ever advised people what to do with their grocery budget, not the whole lot of it. I'm a mess, but I'm all right with that. And it throws people, I think, that you can be like, yeah, I'm a messy, imperfect, flawed, unpredictable, and slightly, erratic human being, but there's no conspiracy in that. It's just, we all are. Just not all of us are living that in a goldfish bowl for everybody to claw over and rake through and throw around. So I am currently trying to pin down a memoir, which is, considering I've spent the best part of 10 years drunk, it's going to be a bit tricky in places, but it's coming back. 422 days sober now. I'm getting bits of my memory back. I'm not liking all of it. I have to say. So, yeah, there've been some bits I've had to cross-reference with friends and be like, so
did I do
did
that?
Did this? Oh, it did. How can I write that in a way that my mum won't be too disappointed in me when she reads it?
We have got some time for questions, and there is a roving mic that will come to you if you put your hand up. I've also got some questions that I'm supposed to have a look, because people at home, okay. Good question. Any tips for budgeting for pet food and supplies? My friend just lost her job, and I mentioned that you shop for £20 a week and have some pets. So to follow you, but she said she couldn't find any tips on pet food.
My cat eats better than I do, unfortunately. There was every now and then I will tweet a picture of my cat's like gourmet little gold tins of nonsense that he eats next to my smart price stewed steak and be like, can't believe my cat eats better than I do. But no, I mean, I joke about that, but actually he eats Tesco's own brand, manky, stinky meat in jelly thing that looks like it's never seen a meat or a jelly in its life. Sorry, Tesco's. But it reeks, especially on a hot day.
Stinks.
But, I mean, there are ways to do it. Basically, you can't just change what your pet eats overnight either, because that is a whole world of, you don't want to go there. Just the gastric distress that ensues is not something I wish on anyone. But pets tend to be all right, largely, if you just sort of, I'd say to people to downshift their brands on stuff that they buy. So if you're buying the supermarket's own brand of anything, go down to the value brand. Or if you're buying the luxury brand, go down to the supermarket's brand, then go down. That applies to your pet as well. You can just sort of switch them out for the cheaper stuff. And 9 times out of 10, unless they've got like proper dietary concerns, they're going to be all right. My cat has eaten everything over the years, from the gourmet pearl little pate little nonsense with the liquid centres, and they do look quite nice actually, to the stinky Tesco mank that you've got to squeeze out of a pouch and try to not get all over yourself. So it is.
Any questions? Yes. Here. Ooh. We can just about. That is being covered. So the question for the people who didn't hear it was about rural poverty and people who, because they live in areas that maybe aren't served by major supermarkets, only have like corner shops or express shops near them. That is something that I've covered over the years with my work, but one of the things that I'm doing with the index is comparing. Firstly, I'm going to the 20 most deprived wards in Britain, like hopping on trains and just seeing what is available there. Because as I said to Asda in the beginning of all of this, if it's not universally available, it's useless. There's no point in having your cheap, smart price mixed herbs in Nottingham if your single mother is living in Southend and has to get 176 quid train to get 30p off the herbs. That doesn't work, unfortunately. So I will be looking at, firstly, the most deprived areas, but also on what we call food deserts, so places that aren't served by major supermarkets, and what is available to people, and the price differential in that. Because I've lived in places, you don't move house 24 times without ending up in various different sort of food sort of circumstances, especially if you don't drive, where my nearest shop has been like a little Asian grocer's, which is great for spices, but extortionate for everyday basics. So I am aware that that is a thing that impacts quite a lot of communities and people across Britain, and it is something that I will be looking into, probably as a secondary part of the index. So the index will go out as this is the landscape at large, and then I'm going to dive into like pockets of rural communities and places that are not particularly well served by public transport, or places that are a bit more far-flung or a bit more remote. Funnily enough, I do a lot of work up here in Scotland with rural communities and places where there's quite a lot of hidden poverty, and part of that is because of what you described. There's just a little corner shop or a little shop somewhere, and that's where people go to get all their groceries. So and while I don't begrudge anybody, making a living, which is what shopkeepers and independent shopkeepers are doing, it is
when people are beholden to that is the price that they pay because they can't go anywhere else, it does have an impact on their budgets. So yeah, I will be looking at that as well. Like I said, I bit off a little bit more than I thought I could chew with this one, but I'm ploughing on with it because I'm stubborn.
Any more questions? I did see some hands back there. Don't be shy. Yes, at the back there.
If Liz Truss was on the phone to you right now, what would you say? What would you suggest?
If Liz Truss was in front of me right now, what would I suggest? You seem like a nice bunch of people. But I mean, in reality, I think what I'd suggest is for her to spend a week or a fortnight at the coalface with me and with the organisations that I work with and with the people that I meet and listening to the stories. I mean, you can't move for a Tory MP cutting a ribbon at a food bank with a shit-eating grin on their face these days. But they can all turn up and listen to a few stories and nod and then go away and then vote against those people's interests the next day because it hasn't quite sunk in. But to spend some dedicated time actually on the front lines of seeing the same people come back week after week because their situations haven't mystically improved, because it's not just a temporary glitch, to see the everyday realities and the difficult choices that people are having to make, and to meet those people in their hundreds and realise that these are not isolated, individual, unfortunate experiences, although they are for the person who's experiencing them. They're actually endemic of a society at large that has forgotten and left behind its most vulnerable and marginalised members. And in 2010, when David Cameron and George Osborne were writing their super-duper big society, all singing, all dancing austerity economic plan, Theresa May stood up in the House of Commons and said that these measures will disproportionately impact vulnerable people, disabled people, women, and ethnic minority communities, and I strongly advise against them. So from their own quarters, one of their own shining lights stood up and went, excuse me, this is going to be a little bit drastic for people who can't afford it to be a little bit drastic for them, maybe you should reconsider. And they ploughed on anyway. So they were warned. And they weren't warned by a gobby left-wing Guardian blogger, they were warned by one of their own. And then and they've had those warnings time and time again, and it's almost like I can't quite work out, or I can work out, but it's quite a devastating conclusion to come to. I used to wonder whether they were incompetent or callous, whether they just didn't know or whether they knew and didn't care. And actually, with the scale of poverty and need in this country, and with the speed at which people's living standards have declined, and with the noise that has been made about it over the last 10 years, and the hard data and the statistics to back that up, and the sheer number of people who have died of starvation and malnutrition in the United Kingdom in the 21st century, they know. They're not ignorant, and they're not incompetent. They're just callous, actually.
I can't add anything to that. Yes, please, next question.
Thanks. So I'm wondering, following on from that, have you had any traction with anyone in the Labour Party at a time when Labour doesn't want to stand with workers on strike?
I keep getting myself expelled, and I think it might be about to happen again. I'm perpetually frustrated by what seems to be inaction from the top of the Labour Party at the moment. But I also know, on a personal level, dozens and dozens of excellent constituency Labour MPs who are doing everything in their power to try to help the people who are in desperate need in their communities. I don't understand how, I mean, it should be the easiest job in the world at the moment to oppose this government. Like, literally everything they say, you just go, that's terrible, that's awful. I mean, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. That's going to disproportionately impact people who can't afford to make those cuts. People are going to die if you do that. People are dying. People have died. You know, it should be where those messages are. They seem to be so locked into this fear of sounding too radical, and actually saying that people should be able to afford to eat and heat their homes and live a dignified life, and maybe even one with a little bit of joy in it, should not be seen as a radical prospect. And I'd quite like them to just come out and say something to that effect. They're the Labour Party. They're the party of the labouring people. The clue is in the name. And if they don't want it, they should, you know, step aside and let people who do want to stand by the side of striking workers, the poor, the marginalised, the vulnerable, the disabled, the sick, and stand up for them. Because all of this PR nonsense is just, it's not helping anybody, really.
There's a question at the balcony. I'm sure it's not called a balcony.
Hi. You're sitting in a room full of, looking about the room, quite privileged people on a Thursday afternoon in Edinburgh, and I was wondering if you could give us some top tips about those fortunate in society, how we can do practical things to help the most vulnerable. So whether it's food banks or whatever, I just really value your input to like empower this room and others to try to help others.
So I'll try to make this answer quick because I'm aware the clock is running down. I was brought up by two working class parents who were foster carers, and I would get home from school and there would be an extra 2 kids at the table, and it would be pop a Z bed out, stick another potato in the oven, cut the macaroni cheese up into like 6 pieces instead of 4 pieces. I was raised to believe that if you've got something, you share it. And we've all got something we can share, whether that's our time, whether that's our ears, whether that's our resources, whether that's a tin in the food bank box, whether that's some volunteering hours, whether that's some specialist knowledge, whether that's, you know, a bum on a seat at the Citizens Advice Bureau who are buckling under the weight of need that people are coming to them with at the moment. Everybody in this room has got something that they can share with somebody else who will benefit from it. Tap into yourself, work out what it is, and give it until you've got nothing left to give, because that is the only way that this is going to get better. We cannot rely any longer on the system changing, or the government changing, or the Labour Party changing. We have to be the change, and every single one of us can impact another human being in what may seem like a really small way to us, but could genuinely save their lives. And that's what you can do.
Thank you, Jack. Completely inspirational, words to live by. Jack will be signing books outside. If you can all just remain where you are for a couple of minutes while we leave. Jack will be signing books very shortly outside. And I know you've given her lots of applause, but just one last time, thank you, Jack Monroe.